Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Folks who knew someone back in high school who was eventually charged with murder, what were they like back then? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
Kinda strange dude, but very quiet and soft-spoken, good at pencil drawing. About 5 years after high school, he took a kitchen knife in each hand and stabbed his uncle to death. Drove to his girlfriend's house, took a shit in her yard, forced her into the car, and drove her to another state. Let her go, and turned around and drove back. Asked to use the phone at a gas station, and was told no, until the cashier looked up and realized he was absolutely covered in blood. Called the cops and surrendered. Never saw that one coming. His mom, a teacher at the high school, was hit by a negligent semi-truck driver in front of the school and passed pretty much instantly. 8 years later, he got arrested for hiring someone to hunt down and kill the truck driver. What makes it truly tragic is when he got arrested, he had just won a very messy custody battle for his kid from his incredibly abusive and horrible ex-wife. He was a good kid. He just never quite moved on from what happened. Went to high school with Jimmy Holmes, the Aurora theater shooter. Same graduating class, same circle of friends. He was a typical nerd like the rest of us, into anime, video games, MTG, edit, Magic the Gathering. During lunch in the calc teacher's classroom, he was a bit eccentric, but we all were back then, trying to fit in with other weirdos. I never knew about his mental health or illness struggles. It was sobering to see him on the news. It didn't register that it was him at first. He looked like a completely different person, and not just physically. His eyes were the most striking part. You could almost see the mania. They didn't look like that before. Not murder, but manslaughter. He was popular, cocky, well-off, entitled, but really no different than most of the preppy rich kids. He wasn't even really a bully so much as a jerk. I was not cool nor popular, but I got to know a different side of him as a tutor. Despite his popularity and stunningly good looks, dude could have easily been a model. He was dyslexic and would stutter if he got nervous. He wasn't dumb, but he struggled to learn and covered his insecurity with bravado. Anyway, about a month after his 21st birthday, he got into a bar fight. From all accounts, both he and the victim were equally drunk, equally belligerent, and fighting over the typical stupid young, drunk men fight over. He caught the other guy with one of those 1 in a million punches that killed him. Despite having considerable family wealth, he didn't fight it, took responsibility, and pled guilty without a plea deal. He got 7 fixed with 13 indeterminate, got paroled at 10. Note the victim's family asked parole to be denied at the 7-year hearing, had no objection to release at 10. We stayed in touch, and I can say this guy took what he did very seriously. Spent his incarceration working on his education and bettering himself, and is out now, staying sober, working, and engaged. Guy named Chris. Always acted like a tough guy. Wasn't fun to be around at all, just a dickhead at all times. In a bar, he lost a game of pool, ran his mouth to a bunch of guys bigger than him, got the shit beat out of him, came back and shot up the place, killing a couple people. Doing life and probably still a dickhead. I knew someone who was best friends with Dennis Rader all through childhood up until he was identified as BTK. Rader is in an F-load of their childhood photos because they were always at each other's houses growing up. It messed up every member of that immediate family when it became undeniable that Rader was BTK. To say they had no idea would be a massive understatement. It caused its own kind of trauma, trying to acknowledge that these seemingly separate entities were actually the same person, one who they trusted and allowed around their kids. They were also forced to accept that they were with him immediately before or after some of the crimes. Knowing you spent those years terrified of BTK, and then realizing he was in your house the whole time, is a unique kind of mind F. In elementary school, an older, bigger kid who lived a few houses down from me was picking on me one afternoon on the bus ride home. My memory is foggy, But I recall my brother intervened and the kid, in retaliation, crushed my brother against the seat of the bus until the bus driver stopped him. I always knew him as a bully, stereotypically so too. He was big for his age, aggressive. 20 years or so later, it turned out that he'd murdered his girlfriend's husband, held the man's head in a dog bowl of water until he died, then buried his body in a fire pit on his property. He bragged about it to his friends and eventually was arrested. The police suspected he'd killed others before, buried their bodies on his property, or in the state park. In an interview with the local paper, one of the detectives said something to the effect of, "I've investigated violent crimes for 30 years, and this guy scares me." Attempted murder. She always had an excuse for why she did bad things. Cheated on tests, she didn't have time to study. Stole money from work, my bills were due. Hit her husband, he was too feminine. Went into so much debt that they lost their home, she deserved nice things. Hired a hitman, her husband wouldn't give her money for meth. Popular cheerleader, stereotypical blonde and pretty. Not smart, but not stupid either. Most of her stupidity was an act. She dated a guy who got her into heroin. Her and the boyfriend wanted money for drugs, so they texted this other guy who was also in our grade and had been following her around like a lost puppy for years. They drove him to an ATM and made him withdraw all his money at gunpoint, then drove him into the woods, shot him, and left his body there, all for less than $200. Absolutely horrible. She's going to spend most, if not all, of her life in jail, and rightfully so. He was cute and nice. I was in band with him and he worked at the same department store as I did, so he would come visit me in my department on his breaks. He murdered his wife and did the thing where he begged the community for info on the murder and helped the authorities try to find the culprit. Made himself look like the heartbroken spouse of the victim until he was eventually caught and put away for 25 years. My best friend's sister, who had schizophrenia, went off her meds and killed her mother. The family was already reeling from having lost their father. He had developed lung cancer, and when they were doing a biopsy of his lung, the doctor slipped and punctured a vein or something, triggering a heart attack and a stroke. He never recovered from the stroke and died 10 days later. The mother was an invalid that he had been the primary caretaker with the help of their daughter. And while on her meds, she was able to help her mother as needed. But once the father died, there was no one checking if she was taking her meds, and she eventually slid off of them. She became obsessed with the thought that her mother was trying to cut her out of the will or something, and she took a knife to her one day. She tried to cover it up, claiming someone else came in and attacked her, but the evidence was too clear, and her story was very incoherent. It destroyed the entire family. My friend is still broken by the events years later. Within a couple of months, he went from having both of his parents and a loving sister to everyone being effectively gone. She made the news and was fairly infamous. People still give their house a cold shoulder in the neighborhood. Aspects of my life are pretty hellacious. I live with severe chronic pain and other issues, but I look at what happened to him and tell myself, someone always has it worse. The smartest person in our high school was in an abusive home, and to my understanding, they had a bad trip and killed an abusive parent. They got out later and seemed to be a really good force, advocating for the criminal justice system reforms and other good things. Band kid, super nice, a little reserved. We hung out middle school until he killed his brother when he was 25-ish. It actually happened in our high school parking lot. The details were hazy, but he stabbed him multiple times. It was during bath salts craze, and it wouldn't surprise me if he was on them. He served minimal jail time, got out, and proceeded to do a bunch of armed robberies. Shit's wild. I went to a magnet school in South Florida that was in a pretty bad neighborhood. The first year, we were segregated to our own floor and escorted everywhere. The second year, we weren't as supervised, but still had security around. The third year, we were released to the hounds. I, a tiny white kid, befriended a gigantic black student by making him a few things in woodshop class. He looked out for me, and often stood in for me in a fight. I got jumped in the bathroom one day, and while walking back to class, bloody and crying, he saw me walk past his class. He came out and asked me what was up. I pointed to the two kids that jumped me, and he cornered them and got my money plus some back. Told him never to with me again. The last day of school was an absolute war zone. We literally had SWAT across the street trying to keep the fights to a minimum. My buddy ran with me and other students to the bus to keep our scrawny little white asses from getting killed. Well, about 4 years later I was watching the news and he popped up on a wanted segment. He was wanted for murder of 3 people. The 3 people were gang members, but the way he did it caught the public eye. They rolled up on a busy intersection in Miami, and he was across the street with some homies. He walked up to the car and executed the driver, then the passenger in the back. The front passenger got out, but was hit by a car that was getting the hell out of there. He walked around and shot that guy a few times. He then walked back to his homies, handed them the gun, and left. He was caught in Alabama later that year and was shot by police while stepping out of the house. Was never charged because he committed suicide immediately after the murders when cornered by police, but my childhood next-door neighbor. They lived behind us in our neighborhood, and when I was 6 and he was 5, we were friends and would play together. I witnessed him receiving his 4th concussion to that point when he ran headfirst into a low fence while trying to catch a football. We moved away when I was 7, but when I turned 17, I saw the news story about him murdering his parents and babysitter. He had a babysitter because, multiple early childhood concussions and brain issues. The cops eventually cornered the babysitter's stolen car he was fleeing in, and he shot himself before he could be apprehended. Hadn't seen the kid in 10 years, but it really effed me up to think about it when I found out. I worked with a guy when I was 14 who was just a complete dick. No regard for compassion. Went to high school with him and his younger brother. I bought some green from him, waited 4 hours, and didn't get what I paid for. 4 years later, comes into the restaurant where I was working, ordered food, and then disappeared for an hour. They were about to call the cops for a dine-and-dash when he walked in, and it was obvious he had been shooting heroin behind the building. He couldn't pay for his food because his gift card was worthless. They ended up kicking him out. So chaotic. A couple of months later, I'm at a gas station, and he is high on heroin again and slowly counting pennies for a pack of cigarettes. I thought about buying his smokes to save myself time, but remember, he jacked me. Years later, he's on the news for murder. He was drunk and high at a bar at 11 a.m. and drove home, ran over a guy getting his mail, and continued home, parked on his front lawn and went to bed. The story should be over, but no. Years later, on the news for murder. His brother, who I took shop class with and was a much better person, was drunk and high, driving home, and ran over a 10-year-old who was on a bicycle crossing a crosswalk. Same prison, same time. My first boyfriend in 7th grade, his parents were absent. His dad was a well-known doctor in our town. I don't know if the mother was in the picture. He was loud and the class clown, but developed an early interest in porn. I ended up moving away when I came back to town when I was around 18. My old school friends told me he had lured his ex-girlfriend, who was pregnant with his child, with the help of his current girlfriend, who was 16 and also pregnant, to a cabin in the woods, and he brutally killed his ex with the help of the current one. Tried to hide the evidence and all. He's currently serving life in prison. The girlfriend got out early, and the doctor, his father, is dating the girlfriend's mother. So the mom, the girlfriend, killer girl, and her son all live together.
Well, now there is a tragic tale that took a very strange turn. I had to read it a few times afterwards. So the murderer's father is now dating the accomplice's mother, and the accomplice is living in their house together. Boy, that's... Oof.
College friend I used to party with. He was always the guy with mushrooms and whatnot, but he was more an indie rocker hippie type, generally a good spirit and a fun guy to be around. After college, he started doing acid and PCP all the time. His posts on Facebook started to get more and more unhinged, conspiracy theories, etc. Everyone who knew him in college and before eventually stopped talking to him because he was just making everyone super uncomfortable. A few years later, there was a news article plus a video of him following some old man home and beating him nearly to death with a chair in broad daylight. wasn't even high at the time. Brain was just utterly fried. I don't know if the old man survived or not in the end, but the former friend went to jail for at least attempted murder, if not ultimately murder. He was an asshole. I live in a small southern town, so football is king here. The environment is toxic because everyone knows that football players are untouchable, and the ones whose parents had money had ultimate privilege. This guy is one of those guys. He was rude, cocky, and about as dumb as a rock. Mommy and Daddy bought him a brand new Mustang, which he wrecked because he was speeding in the rain and ran it into a gully. He was rewarded for his stupidity with a brand new Ford Raptor, which he had for roughly a year before he ran an elderly couple off the road because he was trying to pass 5 cars on a blind hill, and the old man had to swerve to prevent from being hit head-on. The couple was fine, but I remember hearing him joke and laugh about the incident later. Naturally, he had an ever-revolving door of girlfriends, which he constantly cheated on. Once we were at a party, which was at a small hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere. Country kids are weird as hell at having fun, lol. He got caught effing a girl outside by his girlfriend, who was literally standing 10 feet away from him, but talking to her friends. That's how bold this guy was. Total douche. Anyway, after graduation, I went to college in the biggest city close to our hometown, which was about an hour away. About 2 years later, I was watching the local news, and I hear a story about a homeless man who was the victim of a hit and run. Apparently, he was in the downtown area and was riding his bike in a bike lane, and someone hit and left him to die alone in the street. A week or so later, the story pops up again, and it was high school asshole's mugshot. He was a limo driver. I guess he started his own business, I don't recall, and he had been drinking heavily before getting into a big-ass limo and murdering a man in the street. He tried to hide the damages to the limo, which only directed attention straight to him, and was convicted of manslaughter. He goes up for parole in 2027. I have a friend in prison potentially for life. He shot a man in the back of the head during a dispute or drug deal as he was walking away, then dragged the body into the house and attempted to burn it down, ditched the gun and his phone over a bridge. When he came to my high school, my mom let me know he was transferring from the school she was working at as a nurse. She worked for a school for delinquents in town, and he was released to reattend public school. He also happened to share my homeroom and got a job where I was working. I quickly made friends with him since he was quiet and no one really seemed to pay him any mind, and I wanted to make sure he felt included after being subject to his previous arrangements. He's always been a funny, fun-loving guy that truly had the shit handed to him time and time again. His dad was a Navy officer that moved around a lot, so he and his brother spent time base hopping through most of their childhoods. Social skills left something to be desired, and they weren't very well educated either. They definitely learned more in the streets than a classroom or at home. His girlfriend was pregnant at the time, and I was able to watch him grow from an aloof, troubled teen into a man trying his best for his family. And he was doing pretty well for a while, too. He found a better job and got himself a car and was working on getting a place for his family. Rougher times hit, so they moved back into his dad's house and used the upper apartment. Sadly, things started falling apart. His dad started to get more abusive again. His relationship fell apart after kid number 2. She left and took the kids back to her hometown hours away, and he moved in the opposite direction to try and escape. We lost touch at around that time, and I couldn't get a hold of him anymore. As for what he was like, a good man at heart, trying desperately to survive in a world that left him far behind before he had a chance. He was extremely protective of his younger brother and tried to encourage him to learn from the mistakes he already made. He was always been a caring man in a world that had no place for them. Once he found comfort and support for the few years I had known him, he showed an immense amount of promise. He wanted to make sure his kids had a better life than he did, but tried to do so with the only ways that he knew how. Unfortunately, my mom and I both knew that something like this had a high likelihood of happening. When I saw the news article, my heart sank for a moment, but I had already known that whatever was being reported was fact. I sent it to her immediately, and she essentially had the same reaction. We really tried to guide him in the right direction and offer support that he lacked, and it truly helped him for a while. Sadly, though, circumstances changed and old habits are far too easy to fall back into. I was helping a friend move a couple of years ago when he called me from lockup for the first time. He had gotten my new phone number from someone, I don't remember who, and for some reason, I answered the phone. I never answer the phone unless the number is saved in my contacts. He wanted to reach out to me and thanked me for trying to help. We were having a good conversation and catching up before his time ran out, and I still remember him apologizing to me for not doing better just before the time ended. We've talked more since then, and someday I'll have the courage to visit him. Until then, I answer the phone when that number appears, and I send postcards and letters to remind him that he's still worthy of love and support in his life. I used to think that the world was black and white until the moment I saw the article about him. I had family members killed from gun violence, and you see about it in the news all the time. I know that he's remorseful, and if what he's done, and he punished himself more every day than the system ever will. The most important thing that I've taken away from this so far is that in most of these cases, both the perpetrator and the victims are just people, both trying to make it through life with the hand they've been dealt. Everyone failed both of those men time and time again, and it cost both of them their lives, one above ground, one below. I had a class with this guy in my high school ROTC class. I think from movies and TVs, you always suspect that there are obvious signs or that someone who's a murderer would make up spidey senses go off. This kid sat a couple of desks away from me, just a quiet, chill, nerdy guy, presented more passive and conflict avoidant than aggressive. He was on the news for murdering his female roommate by stabbing her and her dog, R'd her dead body, and afterwards wrote on the walls with her blood, "I'm not sorry." She was just some girl from another state that came into town for the Disney program for college students. In hindsight, I guess this was telling, but we all gave a speech to the class, and he was the only one that got, instead of keeping it short and bright, went into how he used to be severely depressed and was going to commit suicide. But that all changed when he met some friends that showed him care and that he was now doing better. He pled mentally insane after they found him in his cell with shit smeared everywhere.